Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today, inshallah, we're going to start the macroeconomics. As we mentioned when we present the syllabus or the outlines of this course, in this chapter we are going to focus on the concepts and terms related to the macroeconomics, like the definitions for the unemployment, inflation, hyperinflation, stagflation, expansion, and the different policies that the government use, like the fiscal policy and the monetary policy, to solve the different economic problems or the aggregate problems in the economy. So, in this chapter talks about some definitions, some concepts related to the macroeconomics, which is an introduction to the macroeconomics, right? So let's just start with the difference between, I think that all of you studied the macroeconomics in detail. So let's distinguish or study the differences between the microeconomics, which focuses on the behavior of individuals, the business, the households, and the macroeconomics, which focuses on the aggregate behavior of the economy, right? So let's start with the distinction between the micro and macroeconomics. As you see, the microeconomics examines the behavior of the individual decision-making units, business, firms, and households. So in the microeconomics, as you know that we mentioned, we studied the behavior of the individual sectors in the economy, right? But in the macroeconomics examines the aggregate behavior of, or deals with the economy as a whole. It examines the behavior of economic aggregate, like the gross domestic product, the unemployment, the GDP, GDI, the gross national income, and the aggregate inflation. So we are talking about the aggregate behavior of the economy, right? So the aggregate behavior is what? Refers to the behavior of all households and firms in together, right? So we're not talking about individual, but we are talking about these sectors as a whole. The households, the behavior of all households, the behavior of all individuals, right? As a whole. So, let's go to the roots of the macroeconomics. The roots of macroeconomics, the roots means جذور المacroeconomics. In this case, we will study two schools in the economy. The first one is the classical view or the classical school of economics, and the Keynesian view. How did they deal with the economic or the macroeconomics or the microeconomics? The classical view or the classical economists اللي هم الاقتصاديين التقليديين. Yes. The classical view or the classical school of economics or the economists, the classical economists, they applied the microeconomics theory on the aggregate problems or the aggregate economy. طبقوا ايش؟ النظرية الجزئية على القضايا الاقتصادية الكلية. Right? And they said that supply creates demand. If the firms produces, if the classical view or the classical economists said that supply creates demand. Supply creates demand. This means if the business or the companies or the factories produces or produce goods and services, all of these goods will be sold, right? So if the companies produce goods and services, or if they produce outputs, all of these outputs will be sold. كل البضاعة تبعتنا هتنباع. So all of these outputs would be sold. This means supply creates demand, right? Unfortunately, during the Great Depression means مرحلة الكساد العظيم. Lots of factories produced different goods and services. Unfortunately, lots of these outputs did not sell or have not sold, right? كل البضاعة اللي انتجوها ما انشرتش. So in this case, the classical economists failed to explain the reasons for this their theory. Yes. Yes, we are coming to this point. Yes. So let's go to the first, to the idea or the vision of the classical economist about the labor market. Let's go to the labor market analysis according to the classical view and then to the Keynesian view, right? So let's go to the classical view about the labor market. As we mentioned in the macroeconomics, the equilibrium in the market occurs when demand equals or intersects supply curve, right? The equilibrium in the macroeconomics or the goods and services market occurs when supply intersects demand, right? Where's the equilibrium? Here. This is in the goods and services market, right? And the idea in the labor market is the same. It's quite similar. The idea, the equilibrium in the labor market is quite similar to the equilibrium in the goods and services market. But when we talk about the goods and services market, we are talking about the products, the goods, services. But when we talk about the labor market, for sure we are talking about the labor demand and labor supply, right? So in this case, this is the labor market, and this is the labor supply. Labor supply and labor demand. The labor supply is a positive or has a positive slope, and the labor demand has a negative slope. It's quite similar to the labor demand, the demand for products and supply for products. And this is the wage, and this is the quantity of labor, right? So in the labor market, we have labor supply and labor demand. When labor supply intersect labor demand curve, there is an equilibrium in the labor market. So here we have equilibrium in the labor market. This is the price of labor, PL, or the wage. Price of labor is the wage for the workers. So this is the wage. And this is the quantity of labor or the number of workers, right? Okay. According to the classical view, they said that the labor market is always clear. This means the labor market is in equilibrium. دايما سوق العمل في حالة توظف كامل وحالة توازن. Right? So they assume, the classical view assume that the labor market is always clear. Clear means is in equilibrium. دايما في حالة توازن. And we have a full employment. There is no unemployment in the labor market. And they assume that, suppose that the labor demand declined. إذا افترضوا إنه there is a reduction in labor demand, so there is a leftward shifting of labor demand curve. صح؟ الشيء اللي بيصير في ال goods and services market. So this leads to a leftward shifting to a new equilibrium point from E1 to E2, right? So there is a leftward shifting of labor demand curve, and we have a new equilibrium point from E1 to E2, right? This leads to a reduction in labor from L0 to L1, right? As you see. And the wages would decline, right? And they assume if the wage is still constant at W0, قال لك إذا الأجور ظلتها ثابتة عند W0, in this case, what would happen? In this case, this is the quantity of labor demanded, صح? And this is the quantity of labor supplied. So a quantity of labor supplied is larger than the quantity of labor demanded. Quantity of labor supplied, في عندنا عرض عمال أكبر من طلب على العمال. So there is what? Unemployment. في عندنا حالة بطالة. So they assume that if the wages are or remain constant at W0, in this case, the quantity of labor demanded as a point on the labor demand curve is larger than the quantity supplied of labor, or quantity of labor supplied is larger than the quantity of labor demanded. So we have what? We have unemployment illustrated here. This triangle illustrates the unemployment rate or the value of unemployment. So if the labor supplied or the quantity of labor supplied, the number of labor supplied is larger than the quantity of labor demanded, in this case we have unemployment. This leads to what? Part of the unemployed workers will accept to work with lower wages. So as you see, if there's a high unemployment rate, some of large part or large number of workers will accept to work with lower wages. بيقبلوا انه اذا في عندنا بطاله هيقبلوا انه نشتغل باجور اقل. مظبوط ولا لا؟ So this leads to reduce the wages. In this case, the wage would decline to reach W1, from W0 to W1. So they assume that the wage or the wages are flexible or elastic. And yes, for what? Okay, but our assumption is, or their assumption is, we have a high unemployment rate, right? The high unemployment rate leads to what? Leads to a reduction in the wages, because part of them or part of these workers will accept to work with lower wages. Okay, and then this leads to what? To a reduction in the wages, right? And this is the gap. The unemployment would be solved. So to get rid of unemployment, the wages would decline without any intervention by the government. So they assume that there is no need for the government intervention. ما فيش حاجة لأن تتدخل الحكومة لأنه تلقائيا the wages would decline, right? And vice versa for sure. They assume that if the wages or if there was an increasing in labor demand. This is the labor supply, 1. The labor demand, 1. And this is E1, the wage 1, QLD1. Right? طبعا هنا, as you see, the value of unemployment is QLS minus QLD. Sorry, yes. اللي هو L0 minus L1. This is the value or the gap between, or the difference between quantity of labor supply and the quantity of labor demanded. This is the value of unemployment, right? And now suppose that the labor demanded increased. We are analyzing according to the classical view. They assume that if the labor demanded increased from LD1 to LD2, in this case, they assume that we will shift directly to a new equilibrium point in the labor market. So, there is a rightward shifting of labor demand curve. This leads to a new equilibrium point from A1 to A2, which leads to increasing the wages from W1 to W2, right? So they assume that the wages are elastic. So, and we have a market clearing. Market clearing means, the market is always at equilibrium or in equilibrium. دائما السوق في حالة توظف كامل وحالة توازن, full employment, right? طيب, suppose that the wages remains constant at W1, what would happen? يعني لو بدنا نفترض انه الاجور ظلت جامدة وفقا لنظرية اللي هم الكلاسيك. Suppose انه the wages ما طلعتش, would not increase to W2. Suppose that the wages remain constant at W1. What would happen? In this case, the quantity of labor demanded, as you see, which a point along the labor demand curve 2, is larger than the quantity of labor supplied. This is a QLD, this is a QLS. صح? So in this case, the quantity of labor demanded, QLD, is larger than QLS. The number of, or the quantity of labor demanded, الكمية المطلوبة من العمال أو العدد المطلوب من العمال أكبر من العدد المعروض من العمال. So this leads to what? Directly, this leads to increasing the wages. لأنه في عنده طلب كثير على العمال, مظبوط? According to their assumption. If the quantity of labor demanded, العدد المطلوب من العمال أكبر, is larger than the quantity of labor supplied, this leads to increasing the wages. So the increasing the wages, so we have an increasing the wages from W1 to W2, then we will reach to the new equilibrium point, which is E2, in order to fill in the gap between quantity of labor demanded and the quantity of labor supply. It's called a shortage demand or shortage supply of labor, or surplus demand of workers or labor, right? Is it clear for you? So this is the classical view to the, or a view related to the unemployment in the market. So according to the classical view, summary تبعنا, according to the classical view, they assume that the wages are elastic, right? It's not sticky. الوage مش sticky, مش جامد, right? If the labor demand increased, we have a new equilibrium point, and we have a new wages, and the quantity of labor demanded will increase, right? And vice versa for sure. If the labor demanded decline, yes.
Will the increasing of wages fill the gap of quantity labor demand?
Yes, according to the classical view, yes. But we will see, according to the Great Depression period, it would not solve. The unemployment rate would not solve, or did not solve. Yes?
I want to ask, if this theory was applied in the past, can it make solution for their problem in the past? Can
Yes, but I will explain something related to the Great Depression period in order to explain the idea as a whole, right? In details, right? I'm coming to this point, Amjad. Okay? Is it obvious? So they are talking about elastic wages. The wages are not sticky, and there is no need for the government intervention to solve the high unemployment rate. They assume that there is no need for the government intervention to solve or to get rid of unemployment. عشان قال لك مش there is no need، ما فيش حاجة لأن الحكومة تتدخل عشان تحل مشكلة البطالة. In this case, they have to use, or the problem would be solved directly without intervention, right? By the wages. If the wages are or the labor demand declined, the wages would decline as well, right? So we have, and they assume that the market is always clear, or the market is always at or in equilibrium, right? Okay. So as you see in this analysis, the increasing of unemployment rate, as you see in this analysis, the increasing of unemployment rate leads to a reduction in the wages, which leads to increasing quantum of labor demanded directly, and then the unemployment rate would decline, right? During the Great Depression, as you see, this theory has fallen to explain this case, which creates the macroeconomics theory. So, until the 1929, the economists applied the microeconomic theories on the macroeconomic behavior or the macroeconomic issues. تمام؟ كانوا بيطبقوا النظريات الاقتصادية الجزئية على الاقتصاد الكلي. هلا نشوف شو اللي صار بعد هيك. According to the classical view, as you see, here we're talking about the goods and services market. They assume that this is the aggregate supply, and the aggregate supply is a vertical line, right? And this is the aggregate demand for goods. And this is the price level, the quantity demanded or supplied of the goods. And the equilibrium in the goods and services market occurs when there is an intersection between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply for the products, right? And they assume that if there is a rightward shifting or increasing in supply, this leads to what? A reduction in the prices. They assume that an increasing in the aggregate supply or aggregate output, there is a rightward shifting of aggregate supply curve from aggregate supply 1 to aggregate supply 2. This leads to a new equilibrium point from E1 to E2, which leads to what? A reduction in the prices. So in this case, we have a reduction in the prices from P1 to P2, as you see. We have a new equilibrium point from E1 to E2 as a result of the increasing in the aggregate supply, right? Yes, exactly. But at this, now suppose that the prices are sticky. جامدة، ظلت الأسعار جامدة. In this case, the aggregate supply is larger than the aggregate demand, right? According to the classical view assumption, or the classical economist assumption, If the price remains constant at P1 in the goods market, in this case, this is point along aggregate supply. So it illustrates the quant of a quant supplied. And this is point along the aggregate demand. So it's a quantity demanded. So in this case, the quant supplied is larger than the quant demanded. Yes. Yes. Elastic. Yeah, elastic means flexible. It's not sticky. Yes. لا ما قلتش No, they ask. I said that. Suppose that the price is sticky. Okay. They assume if the prices remains constant or remains constant, what would happen? Quant supplied is larger than the quant demand, right? This leads to what? A reduction in the prices, so we have a new equilibrium point. So هم ما افترضوش انه البرايس ستيكي. هم قال لك لو انه اجى حدا ناقشنا وقال لك انه خلي الاسعار بتضلها جامده. بقول لك هم قالوا انه الاسعار ما بتكونش جامده. The same idea for the wages. The prices are elastic or flexible. Right? Okay? Is it clear? لا هي الوضع هيك انه لو حدا ناقشهم بيقولوا انه لو حدا ناقشنا وقال لك انه الاسعار بتضلها ثابته لا طبعا بيقولوا انها flexible elastic, right? So in this case the quantity supplied is larger than the quantity demanded, as you see. When the quantity supplied is larger than the quantity demanded, there is a surplus supply of goods. This leads to what? A reduction in the prices. So their assumption is, there is what? There is a reduction in the prices directly without intervention by the government or any other sector, right? So according to their assumption that the price is not sticky, yes. So this leads to a reduction in the prices. Another thing, which is related to the classical view, they assume that if the prices declined, the wages would decline. And if the prices increased, the wages would increase. Because if the prices, they assume that if the prices increased, the workers will ask their employers to provide them with additional wages, right? تمام اللي هو المعيشة. تمام هذا this is what did they say. هذا اللي هم قالوه as a classical economist. تمام طيب. Let's go to another issue. So as I mentioned that the classical view assumed that supply creates demand. Supply creates demand. This means if the factories produce outputs, this leads to all of these products will be sold, and this leads to creating income for the producers, which can and they can buy different bundles of or purchase different bundles of goods and services. So they assume if we have outputs, increasing outputs means supply. This leads to yes, but I'm going to correlate the idea of supply and demand. They said that all of these outputs would be sold, which creates income for the business owners, right? And then this leads to what? They can buy different bundles of goods and services and raw material. Yes, exactly. So supply creates demand. Right? This is what did they say. Okay. During the Great Depression, unfortunately, there was large quantities of outputs and no one bought it, which called a recession or deep recession, اللي هو depression. في بضاعة كثير ومحدش راضي، محدش قادر يشتري. هم according to the classical view, they assume that if we have large outputs, all of these outputs would be purchased, because increasing in the outputs leads to a reduction in the prices. هم ايش قالوا؟ انه increasing the outputs leads to a reduction in the prices. A reduction in the prices leads to increasing the purchasing power for the consumers, increasing the ability to purchase. This leads to increasing in the aggregate demand. Unfortunately, during the Great Depression, we have high outputs or large quantities of outputs, and these outputs did not market it or have not sold, right? Because the consumers didn't have the ability or the capability to buy these products. Why? We are coming to this point. No. During this period, during the Depression, the prices declined. We have high unemployment rate. We have high outputs. And all of these outputs stored. تم تخزينها. تمام؟ فخلينا نشوف what are the main causes for the Great Depression and the prolonged or deep recession. Right? The Great Depression. The Great Depression was a period of severe economic contraction and high unemployment that began in 1929 and continued throughout the 1930s. استمرت لفترة الثلاثينات كمان. Right? The Great Depression has started by the crashing of stock markets. بدأت عملية أو اللي هو the Great Depression period by a stock market crash, انهيار في البورصة. So as you see, in this period, there was a reduction or the real output decline because we have an overproduction of goods, right? So the factors declined or decreased their production. During this period, we have high unemployment rate. The prices declined. And some of 7,000 banks failed, closed, right? And as you see, here we have high unemployment rate. This is a photo related to the stock market crash. Yes. So by 1929, many Americans were invested heavily in the stock market. في 1929 كل الناس صارت تشتري stocks of bonds, أسهم وسندات, and they invested heavily in the stock market. طيب, the banks or the stock market had become the most visible sector for investment. So all the Americans invested heavily in the stock market. هذا في الوين 1929. Then So as you see, all of them went to the stock market. They purchased a stock market, stocks and bonds. Through most of 1920s, stock prices rose steadily. طبعا there was high demand on the stocks. So for sure the prices of stocks would what? Would increase. If there is a high demand for stocks, so the prices of stocks would increase. And the speculation means المضاربة. صاروا يضاربوا بيشتري stocks وبيخزنها عنده. تمام. Too many Americans were engaged in speculation, buying stocks, bonds, hoping for quick profits. So as all of you, or all of the Americans in this period, on that period, tried to gain high profits. So they invested heavily in the stock. High demands on stocks and bonds before 1929. قبل الفترة هذه الكل كان بيشتري bonds وبيشتري stocks. So as you see, this diagram or this figure illustrates the demand for stocks. It illustrates the increasing and the demand for stocks from D1 to D2. This leads to increasing the prices of stocks, right? This is in 1922, 1928. In 1929, the prices of stocks started to decline. صار في انخفاض في أسعار الستوكس. بدأ اللي مستثمر أصلا في الستوكس بدأ يواجه مشاكل في طالما إنه في reduction في prices of stocks صار بده يبيع. كمان البانكس invested heavily in the stocks in that period. So as you see, high percentage of Americans sold their bonds and stocks. كل صار يبيع. So supply for stocks declined. Increased. The supply for stocks increased in this period. So the prices would decline. Yes. So the stock market crashed. Crashed mean انهار. Collapsed. The prices of stocks decreased and the profits of speculators decreased or declined. طبعا صار المزام انت كنت مشتري السهم ب1000 صار يجيب لك 200. You face a loss. Yes. So as you see, this diagram illustrates the increasing and the supply of stocks from S1 to S2. So this leads to a reduction in the prices of stocks in that period in 1929. Most people didn't have money to buy the flood of goods factors produced. ولا واحد قادر يشتري البضاعة اللي بتنتج على المصانع لأنه خلاص خلصنا. So the factors and business collapsed and closed. طيب, unemployment rate increased. For sure. And according to the classical view, they assume that if we have or the output increase, the aggregate demand would increase, according to the classical view. But in this period, as you see, we have high outputs. Unfortunately, the consumers did not have the ability to buy these floods of products produced by the factories, right? So the business collapsed, closed, and the unemployment rate increased. As you see, we have a financial collapse. But what? Because the banks also invested heavily in the stock market. كمان مش بس الناس اللي استثمروا في الستوكس في الفترة ديك. البانكس. So after the crash, many Americans withdrew their money from the banks. الناس معوش مصاري راح سحب فلوسه من وين؟ من البنك. So the banks had invested heavily in the stock market and lost money. So the banks collapsed as well. Now, according to the classical view, or the Keynesian view, we have high outputs or larger quantities of outputs, and there is no demand, no aggregate demand, or the aggregate demand is low. So what could the government do in order to stimulate the aggregate demand? This is what the Keynes said, or the John Maynard Keynes in 1936. He assumed that the government should make an intervention to solve the problem. We have high unemployment rate, we have an overproduction of goods, and the people didn't have the ability to buy. So what is the solution? Yes, but what? He recommended that the government should stimulate the aggregate demand. لازم على الحكومة انها تشجع الطلب. ما زال الناس مش مع مصاري. والunemployment عالي. والبضاعة مخزنة عندنا في المخازن. So it has to use an expansionary fiscal policy. سياسة مالية توسعية by increasing expenditure on to buy different products and goods and services. So, according to the Keynesian theory, the level of employment is not determined by the wages and prices, but it determined by the aggregate demand for goods and services. في الكلاسيكال شو قالوا؟ قالوا إنه الwages and the prices is not sticky or are not sticky, so flexible to solve the unemployment. But according to the Keynesian view, it's not. So the government should stimulate the aggregate demand by using an expansionary fiscal policy. يعطيكم العافية.